When the waiter bent to collect the silver napkins and a careless laugh spilled across the long table, her smile did not move. The room glowed with soft light and polished pride. Crystal flutes trembled with names engraved into their thin glass. Old portraits stared down as if memory itself wore a suit. In that room, she had a new surname and a seat at the end of the table. She was the last chair in a family that measured worth like a surveyor's tape measure. When the mocking began, it did not roar. It brushed lightly against her like a cold sleeve. A comment about the way she held a fork, a joke about her small-town shoes. A story retold with a twist that turned her childhood into a punchline. The laughter tightened around her heart without leaving a mark on her face. She lifted her water. She noticed her husband watching his plate as if it could defend him. She heard her own breath, steady like a metronome. The napkin on her lap felt heavy, like a promise carried for too long. In that slow, cruel moment, she understood that respect is not a gift from a name. It is a mirror held inside your own chest. When they asked her to raise a glass to the family's latest triumph, she did not tremble. She pictured a river from her childhood and a pair of rough hands fixing a leaking pipe. Quietly, without moving her lips, she made a decision that would tip an empire with the gentleness of a fingertip. When she finally set her glass down, the stem left a small circle on the tablecloth like a full moon at the end of a long night. Before that night, she was simply Maya, who loved water more than diamonds. She grew up in a two-room house at the edge of a dry city where faucets coughed and kids carried plastic jugs home as if they were carrying time itself. Her father worked as a plumber for people who called him by his first name, and for people who called him late. He taught her that a pipe tells the truth in the language of pressure. He let her hold the flashlight while he traced leaks with his fingertips. She learned that small cracks become floods when no one listens. In school, she cared about maps of rivers and tiny diagrams with arrows that showed how clean water moved. She remembered a teacher who looked tired and hopeful at the same time and told her to study membranes, not diamonds, because diamonds flashed for cameras and membranes quietly saved lives. Maya took that advice like a seed and kept it in her pocket. She worked in labs where floors smelled like bleach and ambition. She stayed late until her feet ached and her mind felt full of clear light. While her friends posted photos of weekends, she made thin films that could catch the smallest dirt and let through only what the body loves. The first patent carried her last name printed in a small font that felt enormous in her chest. She founded a company with borrowed tables and desks assembled wrong on the first try. The sign on the door was crooked for a year. She and her team drank coffee from mismatched mugs and built a filtration membrane that laughed at salt. It used less energy than the angry machines that ate up municipal budgets. The membrane flexed with the water as if it were alive. Pilots worked. A small town signed a contract. She went to the ribbon cutting wearing a dress that did not quite fit because the weight she carried was not on her waist. It was on her shoulders, when water that used to taste like old coins suddenly tasted like nothing at all. A girl with 2 braids looked at the clear stream and clapped once, softly, as if thanking a bird. Maya took that memory and filed it in the safest place inside her. She met Adrian in a tall building that reflected the sky too perfectly. He walked into her life with the tone of a man who had never waited for a bus. He wore the easy confidence of someone born where doors swing open without warning. He read her company's papers and nodded at the right times. He listened enough to imagine he understood. He came to the plant and wrinkled his nose at the smell, then tried to hide it with a laugh that made his dimples do the work for him. He courted her with the speed of a car that never stalled. His world was private planes and private worries. Hers was small triumphs and loud joy at noon over a working pump. She loved him because he looked at her as if he could learn. He loved her because she was not impressed. When he proposed, he did it quietly. And she placed her hand in his palm like a promise not to disappear inside someone else's life. His family owned hotels that faced oceans and banks that lent comfort to the comfortable. The Voss name hung in lobbies. The Voss signature curled across contracts like a ribbon. At their parties, conversations sounded like weather forecasts about money. Beautiful clothes draped over people who spoke in careful phrases and smiled without showing their teeth. They received her with warmth that felt like a room set to the right temperature by a hidden system. They praised her work with words that hovered above the table like helium balloons. She tried to believe in their warmth. She tried to ignore the way some eyes slid past her to find someone who mattered more. When the empire needed to pivot towards sustainability, They found her deck like thirsty travelers find a well. Regulations had shifted with the force of an incoming tide. Hotels needed new water systems that did not make headlines for the wrong reasons. The Voss board saw her membrane as the golden key. A deal formed across months of sturdy talks and careful math. 5 hotels for pilots, then 15, then 100 across regions where salt kissed the air, and tourists wanted to forget that life ran on invisible pipes. The contract carried numbers that made even seasoned bankers sit forward. $590 million to build and install systems that could turn stubborn water into compliant, drinkable quiet. It would be a flagship deal for her company, Ardent Blue, and a lifeline for his family's shift into a world that now counted emissions and fines like heartbeats. The terms included a clause she pushed for, a small sentence in plain language about dignity and collaboration. The clause stated that both parties would act in good faith, with mutual respect for teams and leadership, including public representation. The lawyers called it symbolic. She called it air. The Pilot Hotel in Lisbon filled with the soft sound of water behaving. Guests drank without thinking, and that was the miracle. Coastal authorities smiled in their official way. Adrian took her hand and squeezed it, as if he were part of the work. She let him feel that way because love is generous when it can be. Her company hired more engineers. A young woman from her old neighborhood joined the call and froze when she saw Maya on screen, then gathered herself and spoke with strength. The work felt like a bridge she had been building since the day she held her father's flashlight. The dinner that changed everything took place in late spring when the Jecks were throwing small purple notes on the sidewalks. The Voss townhouse rose with a kind of practiced elegance, every corner cared for by hands that never showed themselves. A long table waited under a chandelier that looked delicate enough to be breath. The evening began with flutes and opinions. The company's CFO recounted the week like a man who thought numbers were friends. The matriarch, a woman with a posture that could cut fruit, praised new acquisitions in a tone that made them sound like children. Maya sat near the end with Adrian beside her, his smile ready, his leg bouncing under the table like a small engine dot. At first, the jokes came like gentle waves. Someone asked if she missed tap water that tasted like the past. Someone pretended to marvel at her small-town ties and called them admirable in a way that meant quaint. A cousin recounted a story he had heard about her first lab, where a leaking ceiling forced them to share umbrellas inside. He twisted the story until it sounded like chaos instead of grit. Laughter rolled down the table and gathered around her seat like fog. Adrian looked at his plate and reached for his wine without meeting her eyes. The matriarch watched Maya with the curiosity of a person studying a painting that doesn't fit the wall. Desert arrived like a sculpture, a small tower balanced on layers of something that collapsed at the touch of a spoon. The patriarch lifted his glass. He wore a good suit and a bad memory. He told the table that the family had done the difficult thing. They had welcomed difference. They had embraced innovation. They had even endured quirks like lab coats at luncheons. He gestured toward Maya as if pointing at a new wing of his house. The smiles around the table stretched thin. She noticed the maid refilling water with precision, trying to become invisible while handling the most necessary thing in the room. Maya felt a slow anger rising, not hot, but steady and old, like water pressing against a dam. It did not demand a scene. It asked for a decision. The patriarch continued with a story about a prenup, as if it were a charming anecdote. He winked at diligence. He applauded himself for insisting on protection when his son married a woman who, in his words, came from honest stock but light pockets. Laughter. A cousin added that the Ardent Blue deal would be the family's newest jewel. Jokes floated about how the Voss name would elevate hers, how charity and opportunity walked hand in hand. It was quick. It was casual. It was sharp enough to cut without leaving blood. Adrian, caught between the tides, stayed still when stillness was a choice. He cleared his throat, then smoothed his tie, then stared at the chandelier as if it held answers. Maya placed her spoon down, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the plate. She breathed in the faint scent of lemon from the dessert and noted the exact chill of the glass at her fingertips. She remembered her father fixing a rusted pipe in a dark kitchen where a child watched quietly, learning that patience is a kind of courage. She remembered her mother folding laundry and humming songs that lived in the spaces between words. She remembered the girl with braids drinking clear water at the ribbon cutting. In that string of memories, a space opened where her choice could sit. She did not allow anger to paint her decision red. She'll let respect color it blue. Not for them, for herself after dessert. When the guests drifted into smaller conversations and laughter broke into pieces the way light does through leaves, she excused herself without explanation. She walked to the study at the end of the hallway, a room with shelves that held old victories. The desk lamp cast a circle of honest light. She opened her laptop with hands that did not shake. Her team's chat was alive in another time zone, engineers sharing photos of a new pilot gasket that refused to leak. She smiled at their work. Then she opened the draft amendment for the Voss contract. The respect clause stared back at her as if it had been waiting to become real. She did not write accusations. She did not dramatize. She wrote like an engineer. Clear, careful, complete. She invoked the clause in good faith, citing public representation and treatment inconsistent with mutual respect. She did not list the jokes, but she described patterns. She noted recent calls where her team's concerns were dismissed with humor that made young engineers shrink. She referenced a call where a Voss executive suggested they would place Ardent Blue under their charitable wing for optics. She attached a memo detailing compliance risks that had been minimized in board updates. This part mattered. In the pilot regions, an internal report flagged certain hotels for quietly pumping brine into a protected inlet during peak tourist season. The report had been delayed on its way upstairs. Her team had raised it. The Voss lead had rolled past it and asked about photo opportunities with a sustainability award. That was a fact, not a feeling. She included it. She wrote that Ardent Blue could not continue under terms that threatened both dignity and environmental integrity. She cited the termination protocol. She offered a 90-day technical transition to prevent harm. She did not threaten. She did not plead. She signed her name. Then she sent the notice to the Voss legal team, the board addresses, and her own counsel. She CC'd her coup, who had spent nights checking bolts twice. The email left her outbox with a small whoosh that sounded like a breath drawn after holding it too long. She closed the laptop and returned to the hall's edge. The party still sparkled. No one noticed the moment the tide turned. She stood behind a tall plant and watched Adrian laugh at something that was not funny. She felt love in her chest, tired and honest. Love that had learned, finally, the shape of a boundary. She walked to the coat check and thanked the woman there with a full thank you, eye to eye. She stepped into the night where spring air smelled like the season, remembering how to be gentle. Her driver asked if she wanted music. She shook her head. The city moved around her, tall and bright, unaware of contracts, unaware of marriage, aware only of its own endless flow. By morning, the emails turned into calls. The matriarch's assistant asked for clarification. The patriarch's lawyer wrote a threat disguised as a letter. Her counsel responded with calm paragraphs that felt like a steady bridge. Her coup met her at the office, with shoulders set and eyes bright. The team gathered around a table that still had a scratch from their first month. She told them the truth. She explained the clause and the report and the decision. The youngest engineer, the one from her old neighborhood, held her gaze and did not blink. Then she began assigning tasks with mature clarity. Transition plans, site visits, compliance notifications to regional authorities, proactive outreach to hotel managers who quietly cared. The team moved. The room filled with a different kind of energy, the kind that follows a clarified conscience. The Voss calls changed tone by afternoon. The CFO sounded less like a friend and more like a man gripping a rail on a moving train. He mentioned timing and liquidity windows and a refinancing that assumed the $590 million water retrofit as a cornerstone. He spoke of covenant packages and lenders who had agreed on conditions that now trembled. He hinted that Maya did not understand what she had set in motion, as if breaking a habit requires an apology. She listened without interrupting. She documented every call. She repeated the technical facts. The engineers on her side sent overnight teams to Lisbon and to coastal sites to ensure guests did not pay for the pride of owners. She instructed them to speak to the on-the-ground staff with respect that did not need to be earned. News traveled fast because money carries messages on private roads. Trade publications that last week had called the Voss sustainability pivot a model now called it a question. Analysts, who once praised the terms as visionary, now traced the risk across lines that connected water to debt to brand. Within 3 days, an environmental agency issued a notice of inquiry about the brine issue. It had been buried. Now it surfaced. A photo of a quiet inlet appeared with a caption that did not shout. The stock chart looked like a mountain turning into a valley. Inside the family townhouse, arguments bloomed like sudden weather. Old wounds added their voices. The matriarch's posture could not hold the roof. The patriarch's suit could not keep him from sweating. The cousins ran numbers and found that respect, when ignored, becomes expensive. Adrian came to the ardent blue office with a face that had forgotten how to be handsome. He stood in the doorway like a person who had lost his map. He did not glare. He did not beg. He asked with his eyes for a version of the world that would let him keep both love and comfort. Maya met him in a small conference room where the whiteboard still held a joke about filter cakes drawn in dry erase marker. She poured water into 2 paper cups and placed one in front of him. He kept his hands in his pockets, then took them out, then put them back again. She watched him with the calm that comes when a storm has already crossed the field. Her heart pulled in 2 directions, both true. He told her that the family would make it right. He promised changes, statements, a donation with her company's name on a plaque. He spoke as if money were a sponge that could soak up anything. She listened. She remembered the dinner. She remembered every quiet dismissal and every loud praise that never felt like praise. She remembered her own breath at the table. He asked if the notice could be withdrawn while they managed appearances. He believed in appearances the way other people believe in gravity. She explained, gently and completely, that this was not about a scene. It was about a culture. She told him the termination was final because the respect clause was not a flourish. It was the spine. She told him environmental harm was non-negotiable. She told him her company was not a prop in his family's story. He looked down at the paper cup of water, then drank. His shoulders sagged, as if the air had gotten heavier. He nodded, because his body knew what his mind fought. He left after pressing his fingers to the table once, as if asking it to steady him. She watched him go and felt love grieving without noise. She allowed herself to cry later, quietly, when the office was empty, and the sunset made everything amber and kind. In the days that followed, an investor consortium that had admired Ardent Blue's work reached out with a different kind of proposal. It did not smell like perfume. It smelled like earth. They wanted to fund a public-private partnership to retrofit municipal systems in coastal towns where the old pipes wept salt and regret. They offered less glamour and more impact. The contract carried fewer fireworks and more valves. Maya took the meeting in a small room with a plant that leaned toward the window. She insisted that the engineers present and that their questions lead. The investors answered like people who had done homework in a library rather than on a yacht. She signed not with triumph, but with gratitude, which made it feel like strength instead of luck. The Voss empire did not collapse in a day. Empires rarely do. It cracked the way old porcelain does when heat meets cold too quickly. The canceled deal tore a square from a carefully stitched quilt. Lenders called for reassessments. Insurance partners pulled out of green marketing packages that had assumed the water retrofits. Municipal inquiries about permits that had always slid through began to stall. Guests at one coastal property posted photos of rusty tap water the week after the story broke. Even though the problem had always been there, a journalist published a quiet piece about staff exhaustion at hotels asked to pretend cleanliness while the back rooms leaked. The matriarch staged a charity gala for ocean health and found the room full but the air thin. The patriarch gave a statement about respect and innovation that read like a label on a plastic bottle. The comments below the article were gentler than the family deserved and harsher than they expected. Maya's team worked nights to stabilize pilot systems. They were ethically obligated to maintain during the transition. Engineers exchanged recipes for staying awake. The office bought better chairs. She encouraged days off, and meant it. When the Lisbon team sent a photo of a hotel staffer hugging a technician after a smooth handover, she printed it and pinned it above the coffee machine. Her father visited the plant one morning wearing a shirt with a collar that looked surprised to be buttoned. He walked the line with her, hands in pockets, eyes shining like he was watching daylight in a jar. He touched the side of a tank and nodded to it like an old friend. On the way out, he looked at her with the pride of a man who knew how to fix a leak and now watched his daughter design a river. One afternoon, Maya received a letter from a school near the coast. The kids drew pictures of clean glasses of water with little smiles near the rims. The teacher wrote about the way students had started bringing empty bottles just to fill them at the school's new tap, then drink and sigh like old people who had finally found a comfortable chair. Maya placed the letter on her desk and brushed her fingers over the paper. She realized that the size of a deal could be measured in dollars, but the weight of a decision could only be measured in breath. Adrian called once more. He asked to meet in the old neighborhood park where she used to sit on a bench with a book about rivers. She arrived in a simple sweater because simplicity felt like armor that did not clank. He looked thinner, as if worry had carved a small sculpture inside him. They walked in a slow circle while a child nearby practiced riding a bike without training wheels. He spoke about therapy sessions at a table where a family learning to be a family dropped their rehearsed lines. He described the matriarch's silence like a season. He mentioned that the patriarch had stopped telling the same 4 stories at dinner and started asking questions that sounded like the beginning of humility. He said none of this expecting applause. He said it like a man who had finally learned the shape of honesty and did not want to waste it. They sat on a bench. He twisted his wedding band once, twice, then rested his hands. He acknowledged that he had failed to stand up when standing up mattered. He did not ask for the past to change. He asked for a chance to become a different kind of man in a different kind of room. Maya listened. She felt the old love still warm in a place where warmth did not burn. She knew that forgiveness could be offered without reopening a door. She knew that compassion could walk beside boundaries like 2 people who do not speak the same language but still understand that the other is human. She told him that his work was inside his house. She told him that her work was in the water. They parted with a look that replaced promises with blessing. Months passed. Ardent blue grew carefully, like a vine that prefers to curl around the right supports rather than race toward the sun. The municipal contracts brought joy that did not trend. Maya's team became known for listening before designing. They hired a second woman from her old neighborhood. She turned the crooked sign straight for no reason other than it made the doorway feel honest. They released a white paper about the true costs of aesthetic sustainability, the kind that places leaves on brochures while ignoring pipes. It circulated quietly through circles that cared more about performance than performance art. At a conference where panels wore suits in the color of ocean at dusk, Maya shared a stage with an engineer who rarely spoke in public. He explained their membrane with his hands and eyes, and the room leaned in. That night, she walked back to her hotel past a fountain where children played. The water arced in perfect loops. It fell back into itself without complaint. She sat for a while on the edge and let the weak mist rest on her cheeks. In the shallow pool, coins gathered like small hopes. She did not make a wish. She realized she no longer needed to. The Voss name did not disappear. It learned to share space with consequences. The family sold 2 properties that had been kept for memory. They brought in an independent review board for environmental compliance because appearances had become too expensive to maintain. The matriarch began volunteering at a coastal cleanup with a sincerity that surprised people, who watched her hands pick up plastic with the precision she once reserved for diamonds. The patriarch learned to speak in shorter sentences. The cousins found jobs that required them to show up on time for someone else. Adrian partnered with a nonprofit to rebuild water systems in inland communities where tourism never visits. He sent no photos to press. He stopped smiling at cameras like they were mirrors. He started showing up at places where no one cared what he wore. Once, he came to a ribbon cutting as a volunteer carrying boxes of filters. He saw Maya across the crowd. She saw him. They walked to each other and stood within a breath's distance. They did not talk about the dinner, because some things do not need retelling to live as lessons. They thanked one another without words for the work each had done alone. Then they stepped back into their separate circles with grace, as if part of growing up is learning to step back without pulling a thread that keeps others balanced in her quiet apartment, overlooking a city that flickered like a patient constellation. Maya kept her father's flashlight in a drawer. She no longer needed it in her hands, but she reached for it sometimes when decisions waited in the dark. The metal felt cool and solid. She thought about pressure and flow. She thought about the gentle power of valves. She thought about families, the ones we are born into and the ones we build from shared work. She made tea and watched steam write brief poems in the air. She slept with the window open when the weather allowed, letting the night carry in whatever it had learned from the day. On anniversaries, she drove to the edge of the city where the river met the last warehouse. She sat on the hood of her car and listened. Water spoke in the language of persistence. It did not lecture. It showed up. She felt her life responding like a shoreline that has finally learned not to crumble at every crash. The empire that once brushed her with casual disrespect had not burned. It had cooled to a manageable temperature. It had learned that engines cannot run on contempt without choking. She felt no triumph in their struggle. Triumph would have tasted like sugar. She wanted something cleaner. She wanted a world where children drink without thinking, and engineers receive the kind of praise that looks like funding and respect. She told her story in her head sometimes. The way a person checks a healed scar with a thumb, a dinner, a set of small jokes woven with old power. A woman remembering that self-respect is not a crown to wear at parties, but a spine to hold you upright in empty rooms. An email sent under a desk lamp, the sound of a door closing softly, the hiss of water running the way it should. The quiet shattering of an assumption that money can purchase any boundary. The long work after the dramatic moment where real change must live. On a late summer night, she visited her parents. The house still looked like itself, with a small garden out front and chimes that made a thin sound in the breeze. Her mother set out tea without asking questions that would feel like demands. Her father told a story about a stubborn joint under a sink that finally loosened when he stopped forcing it, and simply held it until the metal remembered how to move. They sat on the porch as the sky turned the color of ripe fruit. Fireflies appeared and disappeared in a pattern only they understood. A neighbor's dog barked at nothing important. Maya felt a rare, complete stillness. In that stillness, she saw herself at the long table again, watched the napkin lifted by the waiter, heard the careless laugh. She watched the circle left by her glass on the linen. It did not look like a stain anymore. It looked like a moon, the kind that keeps the ocean honest. On the way home, she stopped at a late-night grocery store. She walked the aisles slow, reading labels like short stories. A young cashier with tired eyes looked up when Maya placed filters and tea on the belt. They made brief, ordinary conversation about nothing in particular. When Maya tapped her card, the machine beeped the same way machines beep everywhere. She left with a small bag and a large feeling of belonging to the unremarkable flow of the world. A year after the dinner, a new hotel in a modest chain sent her company a request for proposal. They wanted systems that worked more than they wanted press. Their letter spoke about staff training and maintenance schedules and community meetings so neighbors could ask questions. The numbers were fine. The attitude was better. Maya accepted. She flew coach because short flights do not require ceremony. In the air, she looked out the window at clouds that made the world look soft. She thought about all the water below, moving in pipes and rivers and throats. She smiled without an audience. At the opening, a child tugged at her sleeve and asked, with the unfiltered logic of children, what water tastes like when it is clean. Maya answered by handing the child a paper cup. The child drank. She watched a simple joy move across a small face. That joy was why she had gotten up early, why she had stayed late, why she had written the email that felt like a release. The child ran back to a mother who touched the child's forehead, as if checking for fever, but really checking for blessing. Maya stood there a moment longer, letting the scene settle where it needed to. When she returned to the office the next morning, a vase on her desk held wildflowers someone had picked from a vacant lot. They were simple and stubborn. A card leaned against the glass with a short message written by a teammate. "We build bridges, water loves." She laughed softly. She knew they built more than bridges. They built stories that did not need to be told at long tables to be true. She remembered the beginning again, one last time. The laugh, the fork, the spoon placed gently down. If she could lift her younger self from that chair and speak to her, she would not give instructions. She would place a hand on her shoulder and let the warmth travel. She would remind her that some empires stand so tall that they forget where their pipes run. She would remind her that power can make people careless, and that carelessness is not a weather pattern you must endure. She would remind her that quiet choices can make loud changes. Then she would step back and let the younger self act. Adrian sent a holiday card that winter with a photo not of beaches, but of a small town fountain built in a square, where locals gathered to talk and rest. He stood in the background, half cut by the frame, holding a wrench with a volunteer crew. At the bottom of the card, a sentence in his handwriting read like a confession and a thanks. She placed the card on her fridge among magnets shaped like fruits. She felt a tenderness for the version of him who had learned to be useful without applause. On certain evenings, when the city quieted and streetlights hummed, Maya opened her window and let the night breathe into her room. She did not count her victories. She did not count their losses. She let the past and present sit like two older relatives who had finally stopped arguing. In that peaceful space, she felt how the world had shifted, not by crashing, but by tilting toward a better balance. Respect, she thought, is not owed to a family crest or a bank account. It is owed to the work, to the water, to the hands that carry it, to the child who drinks. She never returned to that long table. She did not need to, but sometimes, when a soft wind moved across her small balcony and lifted the corner of a plant leaf, she would imagine the great house opening its windows. She would picture the old portraits watching as a maid refilled a glass for herself, sat at the table after everyone left, and took a long, unhurried sip. She would imagine the echo of an old laugh replaced by a new sound, quieter and kinder. It would be the sound of a family learning, slowly but clearly, that the strongest empires are not built on marble and mirrors, but on the simple respect of one human for another. She did not speak this thought aloud. She let it move through her, like water returning to a riverbed after a hard season. She stood by the window until the night thinned. Then she turned off the light and walked toward sleep with a steady step, knowing that in the morning pipes would still hum, engineers would still argue with affection, and faucets would still pour ordinary miracles into waiting cups. He never saw her again at a family dinner. He saw her in the world instead, reflected in clean glass and clear taps, in schools where children filled bottles without thinking, in towns where hotel staff walked into back rooms without the smell of salt and regret. When the wind crossed his garden, it carried less perfume and more air. Sometimes he stood very still and listened. The wind did not say her name like a ghost. It said it like water over stone, not pleading, not scolding, just reminding over and over that respect is a river. Those who drink from it are changed, and those who try to dam it learn, eventually, that it always finds its way.